Hello, everybody. We're here, finally. Season 2, Episode 1 of 1000 Voices. And we've got so many good, inspirational stories and interviews coming up for you this season. We're going to kick things off right. And our first guest in the second season is Professor Carlene Firmin. Professor Carlene Firmin is a social researcher who has developed a framework called the Contextual Safeguarding Framework. And in this interview, we talk about why it's so important to take into account context when dealing with young people. Not only looking at their family structure, but looking at all of these different institutions, how they interact and how they impact young people's lives. In this interview, Professor Carlene Firmin talks about her own upbringing, that context and how that's impacted the person that she is today, and opens up in a very vulnerable manner about things she's been through growing up as a child and in more recent years. She also shares with us a very candid story of a young person that was failed by the system and how things could have been different if context was taken into account. And you don't necessarily have to be involved in any kind of child safeguarding practice in order to use this knowledge. This framework can be modified and applied to all sorts of different relationships and areas in your life. Context is very key, as Professor Carlene Firmin helps us to understand in this interview. So stay tuned. Get ready to learn and be ready to be inspired by this story. But that's that for now. This is 1000 Voices, in here we have Professor Carlene Firmin. Hello. How are you doing today, Carlene?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you very much. And very excited to get you on the podcast, actually. You know, I was looking at your profile. Love the work that you're doing. I'm thinking, wow, that would be so cool to get you on and to understand a bit more about you, you know, and where you come from and a bit more about the work you're doing and everything. So, yeah, thank you for coming on. Much appreciated.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's all good. So, you know, to start off with, we always like to take it back to talk about, you know, upbringing and that kind of thing. For someone like yourself, you know, what would you even say, created this contextual safeguarding framework, and it'd be interesting just to get a bit of context for yourself, you know, what your upbringing was like in your childhood. So just to start off with, could you just start off by just painting a picture for what your childhood and your upbringing looked like?
Sure. So I'm the eldest of 4 children. I have 3 brothers, and they're 5 years younger than me, 6 years younger than me, and 8 years younger than me. So it was quite a big age gap, and then they all came along. Afterwards, we grew up in North London, so first Kilburn, then Edmonton, so we've always kind of been North London people, and I still live in North London now. And we were brought up by our parents. My dad passed away when I was 14, so then it was just my mum and me and my brothers. And we're a really close family. We still spend a lot of time with each other, and we still live really near each other. When I moved out of home, I moved up the road and stayed on the road for a long time. So really close family. Raised in a Catholic home, went to Catholic primary schools and secondary schools. Loved school. Still in touch with school friends now. In fact, I'm seeing some at the weekend. And had a really close-knit kind of church community as well in my early childhood. So all Sunday was spent with people from our church in parks in the summer and that type of thing. So love learning, love debating, and kind of school really carried me through my childhood, particularly when I was bereaved. My history teacher in particular was really important to me and kind of got me through those times. So school was a good outlet.
That's great. And on the bereavement, so very sorry to hear about that. Quite a tough thing to go through as a young person. Without going into details as to what specifically happened, how would you say that affected you then? And do those effects still carry on until now, into your adulthood life?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always difficult to lose somebody that's important to you. And so I think once you experience a tragedy, you're more open to the idea that bad things happen. So it takes away the idea that bad things don't happen to you. So I often approach things with a kind of a worst case scenario and have to talk myself out of that worst case scenario. And I think that's just a natural kind of consequence of some of those types of things happening. But it also meant that we were really bonded as a group of siblings, and with my mum as well, and everything that she did to kind of keep family life going. And I guess I also kind of just carried through the idea that nothing's guaranteed really, and you can't really rely on things, other people and other things to kind of carry you through necessarily. So and then I bought a house really early when I was kind of working, and I wanted to kind of establish a life for myself independently. So all those things influenced me. But I think one of the biggest lessons I probably learned, which links to the work I now do, is the importance of community and the relevance of contexts for your safety and your development. So there was me and 3 brothers, and we all experienced that bereavement differently, and it impacted us differently, because even though we were all living in the same family, we had different groups of friends, we were in different schools, we had different interactions with people like the police and teachers, and my experiences of all of those things were relatively positive in terms of school, for example, or non-existent in terms of the police. I was a young woman, so I didn't really get that much hassle, whereas my brothers experienced policing really differently in London, and some of them had very difficult times in schools, and when those contexts become fractured, and you're going through something painful in your personal life, we're not having an equal experience. It definitely meant that I don't buy into the idea that if I can do it, anyone can do it type narrative, like you just dust yourself off and you work hard. Like, I got to where I am because we had a really solid group of families around us in the church that carried my mum through a difficult time. I was in a really supportive school environment. There were a number of factors that meant that my mum was in a position to be able to get us through that. And if those things hadn't been in place, it would have probably been a lot more difficult for me. So I think some people might look at the story and think, oh, well, she went through a difficult time and she's done really well, so going through difficulties isn't a reason for things going wrong. That's just not how I see it. I went through a difficult time, and I was in a number of contexts that meant that didn't have a kind of lasting negative effect on my kind of opportunities and my experiences, and that wouldn't be the same for everybody.
We're going to get into the contextual safeguarding in a bit anyways, but it's very interesting to hear you talk about your own context, and I'm a massive believer in context being everything as well. No two things are, I wouldn't say never, but very, very rarely the exact same thing. People have their own lived experiences, have their own things going on. So with you and your family, you're very young, you've got a bereavement in your family, and you know, it's going to play a massive role in your life for that period of time. And context is everything. I think that when we're coming to things like you mentioned, schooling, policing, etc., and those are just 2 institutions, but all of these different institutions and societies we live in, I feel like need to take a very much not a one shoe fits all sort of approach, and also quite a human approach to people as well, because everyone's context is different, and not only just context as well. I feel like everybody's mentality, we're all different, we're unique in our own specific ways, and what might affect one person one way is going to affect someone else completely different. What might be me dropping my burger on the floor, cool, that's going to hurt me, that could hurt someone a hell of a lot more. Context, pain is very relative, I feel. So it's very interesting to hear you talk about, you know, your context and your upbringing like that as well. With actually just still in the childhood piece, actually, what's your happiest childhood memory?
Oh, that would probably be, well, it's difficult. I've got 2. Christmas time as a child I loved, and I still love it now because I loved it as a child. It's just magical time where we used to go and stay with my mum's parents, my grandparents, from Christmas Eve through till the day after Boxing Day, and they had quite a large house outside of London, which actually wasn't, it was only about half an hour's drive on the M25, but to me it felt like we were going into the countryside, and we were going to this kind of special house where all my cousins went as well, and we all stayed there for these 3 days, and we had the most amazing food, and everyone was having such a good time. So all of us love Christmas, because we just remember that period of time where my grandparents were quite young when I was a child, so so yeah, they had the energy to kind of cook and entertain us, and that was always lovely. And the other thing I loved about childhood was camping. So we used to camp every summer. That was kind of my mum's way of guaranteeing us a summer holiday, even though we didn't have lots of money. She bought a tent, saved up and bought a really nice tent, and then we could go away every summer and camp and ride our bikes, and that was also brilliant. And again, we still camp now, and my brothers have tents, and we all go camping as a family. So I guess the things that I love most about childhood tried to carry through for my own child now.
That's great. Do you have a favourite Christmas movie?
Oh gosh, I think that's such a hard question, but probably A Muppets Christmas Carol.
I haven't even watched it.
Oh, you're missing out. It's great.
I'll check it out actually. Cool. All right. And what were your early career ambitions when you were young?
So I initially, they changed all the time. I went through a phase of wanting to be a lawyer when I was in school, changed my mind to a historian. At one point I wanted to be a nun, and actually did visit a nunnery, and was really quite serious about that, but then changed my mind. So I went through lots of thoughts, and then I kind of settled for a good while on journalism, and chose to study philosophy at university because I wasn't completely sure what I wanted to do. I loved theology as an A-level, and particularly the ethics element of it, so that's why I chose to study philosophy, and I got a place at Cambridge to do that, and really enjoyed my time there, and spent all of my time there focused on journalism. So whenever we were on holidays, I'd kind of intern at different magazines and newspapers. It wasn't until I left university and started working at a newspaper that I'd realised I didn't want to be a journalist, and actually I was more interested in social justice issues and writing on them, yes, but just in social justice issues in general. So I started to apply for jobs working for the charity sector, and then worked my way up from there.
That's great, and congrats on going to Cambridge. That's a big move. Coming from North London as well, so that's really great actually. Congrats on that. And then I guess somewhere along the line, so you wanted to be a journalist, and then you've gone through some experiences, and you're writing, you're realizing, okay, it isn't actually for me. You've gone and studied your master's, and you've done your doctorate, and your doctorate is where you start to develop the framework, right?
Yeah, that's right. So I was working at the charity Race on the Agenda as an administrator while I did my master's in social policy, because by that point I'd realised I was quite interested in policy, and I hadn't thought about that at all before. I didn't really know anything about it, and I was looking at issues like weapon carrying and that type of stuff when I was doing my master's, and then worked in a couple of policy organisations, government organisations and charities, and then started my PhD, and that was looking at violence between young people, different forms of peer-to-peer violence, and originally I was asking questions about whether they were different forms or they were all similar enough that we could just have one response regardless of the type of harm in question, but by the end of the doctorate my main finding was that social workers in particular were struggling to respond to these issues because they were assessing individual children's needs and risks and the capacity of their parents to protect them when the risks they were facing were in their friendship groups, schools and public places. And I didn't really understand why social workers were doing that because I wasn't a social worker, but I could see that that's exactly what was happening. And so it meant that parents were being unduly blamed for what happened to their children, but also young people just remained at risk and kind of safety wasn't being created in the context where the harm was occurring. So the doctorate led to me kind of coining the term contextual safeguarding and proposing that we needed kind of child protection responses that targeted contexts, not just individual children and families. And then after the doctorate went on to kind of try and turn that into a framework and test it and develop it, which is what I've been doing ever since. Sure, so contextual safeguarding in a sentence is an approach to safeguarding that assesses and responds to the contexts where young people are at risk of harm, tries to build safety in those contexts. The detail of that is split into 4 parts, so it's any type of system, organisation, team or individual practice that does 4 things. The first thing I've already mentioned, it targets the contexts where the harm happens and tries to change social conditions of that context mean that harm is less likely to happen there. The second thing it does is it does that thing, but through a lens of child protection and child welfare, not because of crime. So we do have lots of responses to public places, but they're normally focused on trying to reduce crime. And when you focus on trying to reduce crime, you don't always protect children. You might disperse them out of the area, for example, and that might reduce crime, but it doesn't mean those children are any safer. They might be even more at risk because now we don't know where they've gone. They might be staying in someone's flat because they still need Wi-Fi and they can't get it outside a fast food restaurant anymore because they've been told not to go there. So a reduction in crime doesn't mean anyone's safer. So contextual safeguarding must be focused on children's welfare first. The third element of the approach is that it has to happen in partnership with people who are in those places and spaces. So historically, child protection is just social workers, policing, health services, sometimes education, kind of responding to children and families. In contextual safeguarding, it would be those people, but it would also be youth workers, housing officers, people that run fast food restaurants, people that manage transport hubs, young people themselves, residents, families, whoever could influence what's happening in the parks. We've seen work with dog walkers, gardeners, different people who are in parks trying to create safety in the park, for example. So depending on the context, you've quite a broad partnership. And the fourth element of contextual safeguarding is that you measure the impact of your work on context and not just on children. So you don't say, oh, we did this intervention and now this child's back in school and they weren't before. You would also say they're back in school, they weren't before, and they're going back to school because school is now a safe place for them to be. And we understand that the context of the school is safer. So you've measured the impact of the response on the context. Otherwise, what we see are things like children who are unsafe at school. Either they're unsafe on the journey to school, or they're unsafe when they're in school from other young people, for example. And their parents are threatened with a fine for not getting them into school. So the children go to school because they know their parents can't afford the fine. So if you just measured the outcome for the child, they weren't going to school, now they are going to school. So the threat to fine was a good thing. But if they're going to school just because they're trying to avoid their parents being fined, it doesn't mean they're any safer. In fact, they could be more at risk because now they're having to go on a journey where there is a threat to their life, or they're having to go into a school environment where they're being sexually harassed by other young people. So we have to know that they're going into school because that journey is now safer for them, or the school is now safer for them. We need to know we've made a difference to the context where they were unsafe, not just a difference to their behaviour. So that's what we look for in contextual safeguarding. We look for a response that targets context, focusing on child welfare in partnership with the people who are in that place, and measures the impact of the response on a context. And while all of that sounds quite obvious, it's the complete opposite to what we would normally do in a child protection response.
With that example you were just talking about there and then, with the parents being fined and sexual abuse, do you mind expanding a bit more upon that, and to expand a bit more upon that story, to talk about how that kind of system has failed, or if it has failed the child, I should say, and how a contextual safeguarding approach can or would have been a better approach to take?
Sure. So in a particular case I was reviewing, a young person was not coming to school on time. He was coming in late every day, and then he was coming in late to lessons, and he was also leaving lessons when he was there. And the school had used standard sanctions like detentions and other kind of sanctions to try to get him to come in on time, and they hadn't worked. So they contacted Children's Social Care and raised their concerns about him. And it turned out that he had a sibling with a disability, and there was a view that maybe the parents were struggling to get everyone out of the house on time because of this challenge they had at home, and that maybe things were a bit chaotic and he was struggling to concentrate in lessons. So they did an assessment of the family, and the family said they didn't think that was the problem. They were aware that he was not wanting to be in school, but they said they didn't have those difficulties. But nonetheless, further support was put into the family to help, and that didn't change his behaviour. He still came in late to school, he still left lessons. So after a while, there was a threat to fine his family for not getting him into school on time. That is an intervention that can be used. It's parents' duty, considered to be a parent's duty, to ensure their children are in education. And so if the parents are not getting their children into education, there can be a decision to fine them. And he knew that his parents couldn't afford that fine, so he came into school on time and stayed in his lessons. He later disclosed to a pastoral worker in the school that he had been coming in late every day he was then seriously physically and sexually assaulted by a group of young people in a community setting, but a number of those young people were in his school, and a pastoral worker at the school noticed some of his injuries and approached him to try to understand what had happened. And he initially made up an excuse, and then he did say what had happened. And he said that he'd been coming in late every day because he waited for everyone in school to be in the lessons in classrooms before he would come into school. And then he would wait for teachers to go into the classrooms before he'd go into them. And then when he was in lessons, he'd use the toilets during lesson time rather than at the break time, because if he used the lessons in the break time, he was assaulted in the toilets. So school was very unsafe for him. But he didn't want his parents to be fined, so when that was a threat, he started to come into school. But that meant he was just exposed to risk. Now, in a contextual safeguarding approach, you firstly wouldn't assume that the reason he's not going to school is to do with parenting, which is what happened in this case. You wouldn't target your interventions at parents unless you really identified a reason to do that, and they didn't in that case. You would have listened to the parents and you would have given him more space to say what was happening, maybe do safety mapping with him, to say where are your red zones, your unsafe zones, and your green zones, your safe zones, and your amber zones, your kind of neutral zones in school or on your journey to school, or if they're coming in late. Because he may have been coming in late because he was afraid on his journey, so he waited for people to kind of be at college and then travel a bit later. So you do some mapping to give him some space to start to say, I feel unsafe here, I feel safe here, and be curious about that. And because that would have then helped them understand that he was unsafe in school, and then the interventions would have needed to focus on the school itself, either targeting the group of young people who posed a risk of harm to him with interventions to change their behaviour as a group, and there was a particular group dynamic with one young person leading and a lot of other young people following that behaviour. You'd also want to understand whether the culture of the school was facilitating that. Were there kind of attitudes of staff or other students that were kind of normalising it, and you'd target your intervention there. Try to change the culture of the school and make it a safe place for him to be. So in a traditional response, we assess parenting and we intervene with the family. In a contextual safeguarding response, we identify which context is relevant, and that might be the family, but it might also be a peer group, a school or a public place, and then we target at that place. But across all of it, it's still social work led, it's still child protection. What I'm not talking about is increasing policing and criminalisation of friendship groups, for example, but recognising that harm can happen in those settings. And when they do, we need to be able to respond and not expect parents on their own to provide safety for their children.
It's one of those stories that people would hear and probably be very, very surprised that was to happen in a school, especially just somewhere where if you're a parent you would expect your child to be safe. But then there's numerous examples of where schools have failed children anyways. The one that's come out very recently would be the child queue, which happened some time ago but has only come to light in recent months. But that's just a stark example of how a child has been failed, no context whatsoever. And then this example you've shared as well, there's probably loads of others, and probably loads that probably haven't even made the news, that have happened and may probably be kept under wraps, that are happening that we don't know about. And when you talk about it, it sounds, because I work in sales, and something that we're always taught to do is you don't walk between meeting and assume that you have the solution for whoever it is you're talking to. You don't walk in there and say, okay, great, nice to meet you, Steve. All right, we've got this amazing product that's going to do X, Y, Z. Here, take it off our hands. It doesn't really work like that. You got to talk to them, find out what their situation is, and probably similar to this, find out what their context is. What's happening with you guys right now, and what do you need, etc., etc. Seek to understand. You don't just seek to walk in there with a solution within your head. And when you look at it like that, it sounds quite obvious. It sounds obvious, but I guess in the way these systems are so complex and so many different moving parts. Even though it sounds obvious, it might not always be as easy just to walk in and to apply a framework like that, even though it sounds like it makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things we've learned with testing contextual safeguarding, and we've kind of formally been testing it now for about 4 years, is that just because something's common sense, it doesn't mean it's easy. And we're working in a system that assumes when something goes wrong for a child, the fault lies with their parent or caregiver. And so everything about that system needs to be changed for contextual safeguarding to be possible, even down to the computer systems that are used in a social work department. They're designed to record information about individual children and families. You can't record information about a peer group or a school or a location. The system's not designed to do that. The types of support and interventions that are funded and commissioned, they're all mostly one-to-one support, parenting programs, mentoring programs for individual children, which all have their place. But what we don't have is the equivalent for friendship groups or lots of interventions that can be offered into schools or into parks. So every bit of the system assumes you're going to want to intervene with an individual child and their family. And when you don't, you need to do more. You're kind of upending the system to try to do something that makes more sense. That's why it's taking such a long time. And it's also counterculture, because we see it in the media, we see it in general public discussions. If something happens with a child, you often hear people say, well, what were the parents doing? They've got to have been through something in their childhood, they've got to have been through something. And some of those children will have gone through difficulties in their childhoods, and some won't have at all. And regardless, it's not their parent who then stabbed them on the bus or sexually assaulted them at school. That's not who did that thing. So we tend to fixate on parents and carers because that makes us feel better about ourselves. If I think that this happened to this child because their parents weren't doing the right thing, then I feel better about my children because I think I am doing the right thing. If I accept that actually bad things happen to children and you can do as much as you can for your child and something still could go wrong, that's a really scary idea. No one wants to think that. So it is easier for all of us to just blame individuals, hold individuals responsible, because then it's not about me. I don't have a responsibility for this, and also it's not going to happen to anyone I care about. Whereas in reality, it's our collective responsibility to raise and create safety for children. This idea that it takes a village is very true and not just relevant in other cultural contexts. It's relevant in our own, but we don't know what that village looks like because we're all about individuals, we're all about individual responsibility. And that removes really important safety nets for people to be able to say, actually, I'm finding this hard to do on my own. It's really hard to raise a teenager. They go through a lot. You don't know what's going on with them half the time, who they're talking to. They're out of your line of sight for most of the day. So the idea that then if something happens to them in that 8-hour window where you're at work and they're meant to be in school or on a bus or with their friends, that is somehow you have caused that is nonsensical, but that is how society often views these things.
Cool, but then if anything goes wrong with the child, the first thing, like you said, is culture. Okay, the parents were this, the parents were that. What were the parents doing? When even looking at yourself when your upbringing, we've only spoken for not for so long, and there's only so much you can talk about your upbringing. But then with you, like you've had, gone through a bereavement when you're young, you've got your family trips and your family unit, or your community unit, so many different inputs, yeah, that have influenced who you are today. And at different stages of your life, different inputs are going to have different levels of influence in your life as well. So it's like when you're younger, perhaps maybe your community and your family is going to be bigger. You get a bit older, you got your peers now in your school. You're spending more time in school than you are at home. Just so many different things that are going to affect who you are. It can't solely be on of course, parents play a role, but everyone plays a role. Society plays a role. Everything plays a role. And to take all of that context out of things and to look only solely to one input does not make sense, because the parents might have played whatever role they've played. What role has the community played? What role has the school played? What role has the peers played? What role have the police played? What role have, I don't know, churches, community groups, whatever? They all have an influence on these children's lives. And also in the in the individual sort of context, like there and then at that point in time. So with me growing up in school, when I was in school, particularly more secondary school than primary school actually, I used to always get, oh, Tevin's so quiet, Tevin's this, Tevin's that. And yeah, I mean, I'm more of an introverted person for sure, but nobody ever throughout my secondary school took time out to ask why. It was always, he's just like that. Nobody knew what was happening at home. Nobody bothered to ask. And it's just a lack of context, I think, maybe the way that institutions, especially with our young people, because they're the future, the way these institutions interact and approach young people probably should be overhauled completely, with like a framework that you're advocating for and things like that. I think do you believe that this framework should also be applied, so like with the story you told with the young boy that was assaulted in school, do you feel like this framework should also be applied to the attackers as well, the ones that committed the assault?
Yeah, absolutely. They're all children, and we need to understand what causes behaviour. It doesn't mean that there's no sanction. I mean, it was a very serious assault. There needed to be a sanction. But if we want sustainable change, and if we want to intervene earlier, then we need a welfare-based response. We have to understand their needs. I would do the almost exact same assessment for every child, but then the ones that had obviously committed a harmful offence, as part of that, particularly if they were not under duress, they hadn't been exploited to do it. Of course, we need to have some kind of sanction, but it's important. I'm a firm believer in restorative forms of justice. When we talk to young people, and we do that quite a bit, particularly in schools, around peer-to-peer sexual harm that happens in schools, a lot of young people want a more restorative approach. They want those that have caused harm to them to understand why that was a problem, and they want that person to not do that again. That's their kind of concern. And the way to stop someone from doing it again is to address the drivers of their behaviour. So in the case that I reviewed with that young man who was assaulted, when you looked then at what was going on for the people that assaulted him, a number of those young people had been bullied previously by the person that led that assault, and to avoid being bullied they aligned themselves with him. So they had their own experiences of victimisation that had been missed and hadn't been addressed as well. This young person that was leading a lot of this, he had a lot of experiences of community-based violence, was very unsafe in public spaces, so he tended to exert power in school because it meant he felt better about himself, because he felt weak and vulnerable when he was outside of school. And he also had a very poor relationship with the police, as did his family, and he had some very problematic interactions with them where he had been assaulted by the police. So there's all these different things that were going on that required attention. If his experiences in the community had been addressed, he wouldn't have been seeking to exert power in school. If the experiences of bullying that were rife in that school were being addressed, those young people wouldn't have aligned themselves with him. So those were the conditions that meant that this young person then ended up being assaulted. If you take out the bullying in the school, you take out the fractious relationship with policing and his experiences of community violence, you might not get the assault that young person experienced. And just punishing them also doesn't get us away from that happening in the future. So it's really important that we seek to create safe environments for all of our young people, whether the risk that they then are exposed to kind of leads to them instigating harm against others, being harmed themselves. And a lot of young people are victimised and harming others at the same time when they're experiencing these things. It's very difficult to put all the victims in one place and all the perpetrators in another place. It's just not life. So you have young people, and those young people are human beings. Some of them have been victimised, some of them have victimised others, and some of them experience both those things, but it doesn't define who they are. And so we need a response to those young people and the context in which those young people come to harm and harm others, to try to create safety for as many as possible. rather than saying we need this intervention with this child because they're a victim, and then we need a perpetrator intervention with this child because they're a perpetrator, because that defines them as just one thing, when actually we have multiple needs and experiences.
What's the reception been like from policymakers?
The reception to contextual safeguarding to date has been very positive, and I've been quite surprised by the level of take-up by local leaders in children's services, but also by government departments. Contextual safeguarding has been referenced in the latest independent review into children's social care, which is kind of the biggest review we've had for a significant amount of time. There's also features in, has influenced the design of safeguarding guidance in England, and also features in safeguarding guidance in Wales and in Scotland, child protection procedures. So generally it's been, the concept has been welcomed. The ability to implement it still needs a lot of work, and I recently wrote a paper about this. The recognition of it is really positive, and I think that's because, as you've already indicated, a lot of it is common sense. If a young person is at risk of serious harm in a public place, why are you not looking at that public place and intervening with it? That's kind of a common sense thing to do. How you go about doing that, how you resource it, who leads, that's where I'm sure tensions will start to emerge over time, and we'll need more work to get those things implemented in policy. We still don't have a clear policy framework for a lot of this work, and some of it still sits more with policing and community safety than it does with social work and safeguarding, and that creates a very confusing policy landscape for individual practitioners to then work within. We still, as I mentioned already, operate in a society and in a policy framework that's very behaviour focused, very individual focused, doesn't support us to measure outcomes for anything more than an individual. A lot of policy will talk about whether or not responses reduce truancy, reduce children going missing, increase their employment rates, but it doesn't say anything about the context in which you achieve those outcomes, and we would want more of that, more about the context that help children achieve those outcomes. So we have a long way to go. Even though we've come a long way, we still have a long way to go.
For sure. Okay, let's move on slightly, and let's talk a bit about yourself and your life. What would you say? Yeah, what lessons has life taught you recently?
Recently, that's a tough one. I like a plan. I'm definitely someone that likes a plan, and in work I plan everything. But I guess one of the things I've learned, and I'm sure a lot of people learn in different ways over the course of the pandemic, is that sometimes things are just out of your control completely. And so I've learned more recently that when something is in my control, I have to take that seriously and focus my attentions on those things, and everything else I have to kind of let go of a little bit. So I've had to kind of give up the reins a bit more recently, because you can plan and plan and plan, and things don't go to plan. I lost 2 pregnancies during the pandemic. I had 2 ectopic pregnancies and nearly died on one of those occasions, and none of that was in my plan. So, you know, we had our first child very easily, and then it's been very difficult ever since. And, you know, I've now had to undergo treatment in relation to those things. And so all I've been able to control are my physical health, kind of make sure I'm physically fit, nourishing my body, getting enough sleep. What happens to me is not choosing the right doctor, doing kind of the research that I can to choose the right doctor. Then I have to hand it over to the professionals, because I'm not a medical professional. So that's just one example of what I mean by kind of knowing where your limits are in terms of what you can control, and kind of giving over the rest.
I'm really sorry to hear about that, but I'm very thank you for sharing that. I would say I think that level of vulnerability isn't easy to do, but when people hear, I think I'm a big believer of vulnerability. It's not always easy, trust me. I very much struggle with it, but when I think it's one of them ones where when you talk to someone so directly about things that are so deep and personal, and it really hits someone, it just helps people to feel like they're not alone, and it really helps people. So thank you for sharing that.
No worries. I mean, life is complicated, and I think often, particularly when you have a public profile, and in the world of social media, you tweet the work you're doing and all the successes you have, and I tweet frustrations I have as well. But people can kind of have a rose-painted picture of people's lives, and everyone's lives are complicated in different ways, and how we manage those complications are just as important as how we kind of strategize to influence policy. We're all one and the same. So I've been very open with people about what I've been through, and with work colleagues and everything, because I just think you don't know what someone else is going through, I don't think it can ever be a problem to try to ensure that people know that life isn't straightforward, and we create difference within that mess, rather than, oh, we've been able to achieve this change because our lives are easy. It's just not like that.
Going through, like, there's been, you can go to work or whatever and have a big smile on your face and laugh and all that, not knowing you've literally felt like you've had the worst day in your whole life, and no one's going to know. Which is why I think it's always important to treat people with a level of compassion, because you literally do not know what is happening in someone's life. So yeah, but no, thank you for sharing that. That's much appreciated. What would you say has been the most defining moment of your life so far?
Oh my goodness, that is a big question. It's really tough to answer. Most defining moment, wow. I don't know. I mean, because there's different ways in which your life is defined, right? So I could go down the obvious route of becoming a mother. It definitely changed my life for the better, but it changed my life. It changed how I balance life, how I do life, what I prioritise. But it doesn't define me. It doesn't define my life and its trajectory. Or when I was appointed my professorship, that's been my latest big turning point. It's definitely changed how I'm viewed, and it's changed the types of requests I get, and the access I get to people, to ideas, and it's the culmination of a lot of work. And so that currently defines quite a significant proportion of my life, but it doesn't define it all. So I think I don't have a single most significant defining moment, but I definitely do have landmarks where I don't know, my life, I kind of reshaped an element of my life. But I have this I have quite a lot of things my mum kept from when I was little, and I've got this book that I made as a school project when I was about 9 years old. It's called All About Me, and you write about yourself. And there's a page in the book where I described my personality, and it pretty much was the same when I was 9 as it is now. I made reference to social justice. I don't know where I got the idea from, because I was 9. I talked about a love of dance, a love of music, of family, and I said I didn't like sharing, and all of those things are still pretty accurate. So I think sometimes the moments in our lives that define us sometimes just bring us home to who we've always been, or enabled us to kind of grow an element of our personality that that has always been there, but we haven't had the opportunity to explore, rather than kind of reshape in a quite a significant way who we are.
If you could go back and live one day of your life all over again, what day would you pick?
My goodness. These are tough questions. If I could go back. Probably my wedding day, because it just goes by so quick, and everyone tells you that. But you don't, there's nothing you can do about it at the time. I didn't really eat much of the food. I feel like there was lots of people I didn't speak to. There were moments where I didn't take it in. So potentially that day, or maybe the night before I gave birth, because that was probably the last night I had a decent night's sleep. So I'd really enjoy that sleep in a different kind of a way to how I sleep now.
If you could go back, just the start of your life, and change if you can do some things differently, would you go back and do anything differently?
Um, I don't know if I would, because you just don't know what the trajectory would have been, right, if you had changed one of those things. I would like to encourage myself to be more comfortable in my own skin. I mean, definitely as a teenager I wasn't. I was in a majority white secondary school. I chemically straightened my hair, relaxed it from the age of about 13 for a good 20 years. I stopped when I had my son. And I wanted to be like all the other girls, and I wasn't, and I didn't really embrace that at all. And when I look back at photos of myself, I didn't see the person I'm seeing in the photographs. I didn't I haven't had that much confidence in my identity. I had confidence in my abilities, but I didn't have confidence in my kind of identity. So I would encourage me to embrace and explore that more. But I think that would probably be the case for a lot of teenagers for various reasons, because a lot of teenagers want to be part of something and be in a group, and if there's something about you that means you're slightly out with, that can be quite difficult as a teenager, and that I definitely experienced that, but it's not really an individual thing I would do differently.
I think I'm a believer somewhat that life is sort of like you're on a journey just to rediscover yourself. So like you spoke about, if you read in your book that you've done when you were 9 years old and realizing, oh wow, this is all true, most of it is true today. It's always been there. I feel that we're born in like our purest states, and then we go through life, and then a lot of us lose our ways. I mean, we're not, and then a lot of us lose our ways, and then just through life and through experience, it's about trying to find that inner child again. It's about trying to come back to home, which it sounds like you've done or are doing anyways. That identity piece is quite powerful, you're saying, because when you're young, you start to straighten your hair and etc., etc. But now you've come to a place where you're more confident in who you are. And I think that comes with a level of, of peace, help you be a lot more happy for sure. And I feel like a lot of us are on that sort of a journey, even if we don't know it. What's the next chapter in your story going to look like?
Well, I mean, I hope to have a bit of a breath in my next chapter, maybe take a bit more leave, go on some holidays, and enjoy life a little bit. Not that I haven't been, but it's been quite fast paced. And in my new role at Durham, in my professorship, I work with a much smaller team. We've just finished a load of projects, and we have a much smaller set of projects that we're working on now. So my work feels just as impactful, but much more contained. And I'm going to be doing more teaching than I have been previously, and supporting other PhD students. So I'm looking forward to a slightly different pace of work, and just having a kind of a chapter where you do a bit more of a stock take, rather than trying to kind of innovate and do lots of new things. But I'm not very good at that. I'm always starting new things. I have a book coming out in September. I'm submitting a book manuscript with a colleague. We've been editing a book. That manuscript gets submitted in September and will be out next year. And I'm just discussing another book with another colleague. And I said I wasn't going to write another book after my last one, and that's 3 others. So I'm not very good at slowing down, but I am going to try and have a slightly slower pace in this next chapter of life.
And I'm guessing, are those books going to be on contextual safeguarding?
They are. The next one is on just on the evidence base around risks outside of the family, and what we've learned internationally about the types of responses we need. And the editor collection I submit in September with my colleague Jenny Lloyd is the findings from the latest round of testing, and kind of what we've learned about contextual safeguarding and where we think the work's going. And in very early stage discussions about the 3rd book, so I won't give that one away too soon.
All right, but that's that. Nice one. Thank you so much for coming on. Really, really enjoyed speaking with you today. Yeah. Oh, lovely speaking with you. Have you got anything that you want to say in closing? And also, if people wanted to keep up to date with yourself and what you're doing, how can they do so?
Sure, I have nothing really to add. It's been really enjoyable. Thanks for taking me on a trip down memory lane. I think if people want to follow me, the best place to follow me is on Twitter, just Carlene Firmin. You'll be able to find me there. That's where I post all of my work. I do have an Instagram, Prof. Carlene Firmin, but I don't use it as much as my Twitter account.
Really appreciate you coming, sharing your story in such an authentic and vulnerable manner. So thank you so much. Much appreciated. But that's that for now. That was 1000 Voices. This is Carlene Firmin, and until next time, people, we're out. Okay, and that's done. Season 2, episode 1, done and dusted, all wrapped up. Amazing interview with so many takeaways that we can apply in our own lives. It'll be great to hear from the community. Let me know what you thought about this interview, what some of your key takeaways were. Please do leave us a comment on our social media pages and or whatever platform you're listening to this on right now. Let us know what you thought about this. Also, if you haven't already, please do leave us a review in your preferred podcasting platform. It really helps us in trying to amplify these stories of these amazing people that we have in the podcast. Next week, as always, the new podcast episode will be released on Tuesday. The full YouTube video will follow a few days afterwards. So follow us on our social media pages. We keep you up to date with everything over there. And we'll drop a few little snippets from the upcoming episode there as well. So stay tuned. But that's that for now, people. Thank you for tuning in. This is 1000 Voices, and for now, we're out.